the composer of that song, and she is in the center on the lower group of women right in the middle. That's a far younger picture because that song is from the mid-90s. And the reason that's important, other than it's a fabulous song and she's a fabulously talented person, is that she's a Unitarian Universalist. Oops. Ta-da!
Sorry, I just changed
I say the word
plug.
Unitarian Universalist and we get a sparkle. She's a Unitarian Universalist, and she's a member of All Souls Unitarian in Washington, D.C. And it's one of our most highly integrated multicultural congregations in the country, and she has had a big part of the music there. So you can just imagine it's a fabulous congregation. So I just wanted to give a plug for that. Now let's see if this will work now. Oops, it works if I point it in the right direction. No? Can you move it forward one, please?
We'll try. Okay, when we did the little switcheroo of...
Okay, we'll just ignore that.
No, just hold on.
It's just the title of the sermon, so it's okay. You can figure it out.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to get going. So my story starts, I was at a conference in Dallas a couple of years ago with a group of folks from my company. I don't know if you all know, but I work full-time at Kimberly-Clark as well as do this. And I'm a leader in our Pride Network, which is a group for LGBTQ plus folks to help support that community in the workplace. And there's an organization called Out and Equal in the Workplace that has conferences every year, and this was in Dallas. And we were there a couple of years ago with about 20 of us. And there was a workshop on oppression. And so myself and 3 other young men went to it. And we were talking about it. We had to break out in discussion groups eventually. And we were supposed to talk about a time that we felt oppressed. And then also oppressed others. So it was both. And so we talked about that for a little bit. And then I finally said to the guys, I'm assuming by now in life you've figured out, because you're white, you're male, you're good looking, you're middle class, you kind of articulate, well-mannered kind of guys, that you can walk into a room and pretty much take over if you want to. That people in our society hand you their power automatically because we're just kind of conditioned for that. And they kind of looked at me, because these guys are like 23, 24, 25, and I'm not sure that they had figured that out yet. But my experience, especially in a company, that's what you're designed to do. You're always supposed to kind of take power in the room, and if you don't, somebody else does. And the fact that we are white and male and middle class and Judeo-Christian, we just get a benefit from that. And that, folks, is white supremacy. Now that's a big leap to go from an LGBT conference in Dallas with a bunch of good-looking white guys that are gay to what we think of with white supremacy, which is the KKK and people in hooded white hoods lynching black folks. And so what's the difference? How do you get from one to the other? Well, that's where I really got to Dr. Brene Brown. And like I said, she's a professor of social work at the University of Houston and a famous author in TED Talk. And so she wrote this, and she said, "In American society, we're brought up to believe that the closer we are to white, male, middle class, straight, Judeo-Christian, the closer we are to the ideal American." In fact, she'll say, if you fit in that space, you are pretty much told that your space is America. That's what it is. And this is either consciously or subconsciously what we strive for. We therefore, she says, have a kind of a biological, cognitive, and emotional bias towards this particular construct. Our culture believes that this ideal is superior to all others, and it pervades everything we do. How we refer to things, what we believe is acceptable and unacceptable. Indeed, this is the very definition of a culture of white supremacy. Our ideas of what is best, what is supreme, is white culture as we have defined it. Now today I want to point out that I'm going to talk particularly about the African American community, but this really is about all people of color versus the white supremacy. It's just that Brene Brown's talk was referring to Charlottesville, so I'm kind of focusing on African Americans today. So she talks about 3 different concepts. She talks about privilege, power, and perspective. And she starts with unearned privilege. So really, what is that? Well, for me, in my perspective, I see it as I grew up in rural Illinois, working class family. We weren't poor, we never went hungry, but everything I had was a hand-me-down. We never went out to eat, we never had any vacations. And my parents were very well aware that they came from this sort of working class background. And every opportunity they had, they would show me what the upper middle class or upper class had. And it was pretty clear to me that that's what I was supposed to strive for. Like, we had no air conditioning, right? In the summer in Illinois, you go get in the station wagon without any air conditioning and you drive around. And guess where we would drive? Into the really, really wealthy neighborhoods in our town. And that was always pointed out. So to me, the message, what they said was, study hard, get good grades, get to college, and make something of yourself. It was really code for figure out how this white supremacy thing works, because you are white, you are male, you are pretty good looking, you're articulate, so all you have to do is break the code, and then you can probably get part of the American dream. That's kind of how it came across to me. Now, Brene Brown, and I basically spent my teen years and my 20s, which maybe you'll hear a little bit more about that in a minute, trying to figure that out. Brene Brown had this really interesting example of white supremacy in reverse. She said that her real birth name is not Brene Brown, it's Cassandra Brene Brown. I've got my notes here wrong. Cassandra Brene Brown. And she said, in the South, there's no white Brene Browns. There's no white Cassandra Brene Brown. She said every Cassandra Brene Brown that she knows is African American. It's a very common name, apparently, in that community. And so she realized when she was young that she was never invited to any of the white kids' birthday parties, because the mom didn't know who the kids were and just got a list of the kids on the invitee list. And she realized over time that that was probably the reason she never got invited to any of their birthday parties. Then later on, when she had job interviews, she said this actually happened. She would walk into a job interview and people actually said, "Oh my God, you're Cassandra Brene Brown, oh thank God." Meaning, right, exactly. They thought it was going to be somebody African American and it turned out to be white, and so they were very relieved that that was the case. So she goes, that was a quick way to end the job interview in my estimation, but nonetheless it did happen to her. So she talks about, those are kind of two superficial, slight examples, in my opinion, of white privilege, that just because it's that way in society, she, in one case, well, job interviews got a benefit and the birthday parties didn't. And in my space, it's just because I lived in that world and my parents were very well aware of it, even if they didn't call it that, that was the goal. What about power? Our nation's story is built on white supremacy and white privilege. And I think we all know that and hear that in this community because we talk about it a lot. But I don't know if you really recognize how far back that goes. There's this thing called the Doctrine of Discovery. So it's a document from 600 years ago. It was a principle of international law dating from the late 15th century. It was a papal decree issued by Pope Nicholas V in 1452 that specifically sanctioned and promoted the conquest, colonization, and exploitation of non-Christian territories and peoples. I'm reading a quote. This is actually from the UUA website on multiculturalism. So basically, it talked about non-Christian, but back then, for the most part, Christians, white people, they were the same thing. And I'm sure that this law wasn't the papal decree wasn't the thing that caused everybody in Europe to be suddenly racist and believe in white supremacy. It was probably part of the culture leading up to that. But this was the law of the land that was put into place as the explorers started going out beyond Europe and discovering all these places. This is what Christopher Columbus had when he got to North America, and everybody after that. And basically it said, we're supreme, and it's okay, you can do whatever you need to with these people because they're not Christian, they're not white, that's fine by us. So we had hundreds of years, and it says, of decisions and laws continuing right up to our own time that ultimately can be traced back to the doctrine of discovery, and its laws that invalidated, ignored the rights of, that invalidate or ignore the rights, sovereignty, and humanity of indigenous people in the United States and around the world. So it started 600 years ago in that culture. 400 years ago, we had Africans forcibly brought to the New World. We all know that. Slavery built this country. The cotton plantations in the South were the big manifestation of that. All that cotton was hand-picked because they didn't have machines back then to do it. And it was all sent to the fabric mills, primarily in New England at the time. Guess who owned the fabric mills? Usually prominent Unitarians. They were the wealth of Boston and in New England at the time. And I think you've probably always heard about Washington, D.C. The White House and a lot of the big buildings were built by slaves. Bernays says the only way slavery can work is obviously to dehumanize the other, to imply or state that whites are the only humans. In fact, of course, it was enshrined in our Constitution. We had that slaves counted as only 3/5 of a person for census purposes. Now, let's just ignore the fact that they didn't allow them to have rights or vote, but there's this cultural thing built in that the South wanted to make sure they had enough representation in Congress, so they came up with this mathematical formula that African Americans were only 3/5 of a real person. Well, then we had 200 years of formal slavery. The Civil War formally freed African Americans, but it certainly didn't give them equal status. We had 100 years of oppression after that. It was replaced by other forms of legal oppression. So in the South, you basically had domestic terrorism, you had lynchings, lynching of the weak, basically, and a complete lack of rights over time. But in the North, we weren't any better up here. We had extreme segregation and basically neglect. Then came along the 1960s civil rights movement, and then the overt oppression was outlawed, but it was replaced by covert oppression of subtle white supremacy. So I was in a class once where we kind of had to unpack this in our own minds, because I sit here and like, I've lived in my little white bubble most of my life. I've hardly come across anybody that's not like me, and I didn't own slaves, and I didn't do this, so what's this got to do with me? So we sat there and talked about it. We did this exercise that really brought it home to me. And it starts back from my ancestors. I don't know if any of you are from Illinois, but north central Illinois, down in, well, I guess most of Illinois, has some of the best farmland on the planet, because it was a big swamp at some point in prehistoric days. Well, after the Civil War, a lot of poor Germans that didn't have any land in Germany and were starving to death came over and landed in Illinois and put down roots and started farming. And my ancestors come from that space. So right there, we were given land probably pretty cheaply to start homesteading and building this community. Well, if you think about it, simultaneously after the Civil War was the beginning of the first great migration of African Americans north to the cities of Chicago and Detroit and places like that. And this town that I'm from originally is Mendota, and it means in native languages, meeting of the paths, and it's where like 4 or 5 different railroads cross through there. There was this big railroad station back then, and it's this clear railroad line from Memphis to Chicago goes through there. And I'm quite sure that it was pretty much either an unwritten rule or everybody knew that if you were African American and you were on that train, you don't get off there. Because it made sense to me, if you are in agriculture and you were a freed slave, why didn't you go to where there were the north, where there was agriculture and relatively cheap land, and why didn't they homestead in that same hometown where my ancestors came from? So I'm pretty sure it was part of the culture that wasn't allowed. You weren't going to get off that train. And I'm quite sure probably my racist German ancestors stood at that station and made sure that train just kept going through onto Chicago. And I think we've all heard stories about once those folks reached Chicago, how they didn't understand urban life and pretty much were taken advantage of. Then in the 20th century, sundown towns and restricted neighborhoods. I'm not sure if you know what a sundown town is. Yep. Fond du Lac, Appleton, Wausau, all of this area were all sundown towns. So it was laws written that if you were not white, you could not stay overnight in the city limits unless you were a servant. And actually I saw a deed in Stevens Point where it was written into the housing contract from back then that you could not sell the house to somebody who wasn't white. So it was very clear that you weren't supposed to come to northeast or central Wisconsin at all. And so you ended up Or in Chicago, we all know that I grew up outside of Chicago, and it was pretty clear there were lines that everybody had where if you were not white, you could live, and otherwise you could not. The GI Bill, this is one of them that surprised me. So my father fought in World War II in England. He was in England for 5-6 years, I think. Well, then all the way to Berlin. But he came back and benefited from the GI Bill, which was basically a free education for anybody who fought in the war, or it could be subsidized mortgage to get your first house. My father went to college for about a year, and then he decided that he wanted to marry his high school sweetheart and get settled down. So he did, and got a mortgage. Well, I don't know if you know, but the GI Bill was only for white people. If you weren't white, you couldn't use it. So right there was an advantage once again where my family started gaining wealth that was part of the white supremacist culture. So jump to my lifetime. I lived in Rockford, Illinois. And Rockford is one of the most segregated cities in America. I'd say probably still today, but I don't live there, so I shouldn't say that. But it certainly was in the 70s, particularly the schools. There were the wealthy white kids' schools, and there were the horrible African-American schools on the other side of town. And there was the Supreme Court ruling that you had to segregate the schools, so Rockford was forced to do busing. So two things happened. I was about to enter high school, and that was causing all kinds of racial riots happening in Rockford. And so my parents and I frankly, I was totally part of this, we opted out. I'm white, so we went to the Lutheran high school instead, which is probably the guardian of white supremacy in that town. So we had that option. I didn't have to deal with it. I didn't have to do anything that would have been uncomfortable at all. My brother, this is really bizarre, was in junior high, and he was bused. The whole bunch of white kids from our side of town was bused to a black school on the other side of town and did junior high. I think he was just 8th grade, so 1 year. He said he never saw a black kid the entire time he was there. So they were running basically two schools in parallel. They never crossed at all, just to get around the rule. It was crazy. So in Lutheran high school is where I blossomed. It was a small, kind of safe environment. And I learned, this is where I first came in contact with some super wealthy families, right? And became friends with them and started learning, oh, so here's how that culture works. Here's how I need to act if I want to be a part of that culture. And that really started it and has continued on for the rest of my life, or until I kind of had the call for ministry, essentially. We had one black guy in my high school. We voted him homecoming king because he was exactly like us. So, what are some current indicators then of systemic white privilege? Today, we live in a culture where the majority of African American men of a certain age group are locked up. The worst neighborhoods are usually African American, and we seem to think it's okay. The shootings in Chicago and Milwaukee are always in those neighborhoods. And we often hear we can't improve the education in those schools because the issue is really in their home life. It's really not the schools. And think about it. The nation's near full employment right now, with the exception of African Americans. And this is all okay, apparently. African Americans, I'm sure you've heard this, are automatically suspect as shoplifters in the stores. They're usually followed around. They're pulled over while driving black. And I know that's a cliche, but I have a friend who was in Appleton and worked for Kimberly-Clark and moved to New York City. He's stunning looking, and he's got enough money that he likes to be showy. So he leases a Mercedes and drives around. He is stopped constantly because somebody assumes that he can't afford that car and he must have stolen it. Young black males are assumed to be dangerous. I'm guilty of that. I get off the freeway in Chicago in certain neighborhoods, and I automatically lock my doors because I'm concerned. And then Barack Obama. He always had to prove himself as worthy of the presidency to a significant portion of the population, which was unheard of before the first non-white became president. And then there's Black Lives Matter. Why are so many black men being killed? And society just seems to think it's okay. I know each one has their own specific details and circumstances, but if you step back and look at it, they're always killed. And everybody seems to think that's okay. So why do we need to talk about white supremacy? Brene Brown, in the reading I did earlier, she says, white supremacy is a collective story of the United States, a story that we've never owned, and therefore it owns us. Now she acknowledges that owning this story is very, very uncomfortable. It's like me. I said, what? I've done nothing to these people. I'm a good person. What's it got to do with me? Owning this story as a white person is something I don't have to do. I can walk away. I can ignore it, which of course is another example of white privilege. And she says, if we don't own this story and do something about it, we will continue to live in an oppressive society. A society that's frankly destroying a part of itself. A society that will never live up to its fullest potential. And a society which is based not on equality, opportunity, and justice, but on privilege, greed, and fear. Brene Brown also says that the pain of owning our collective story of white supremacy is far less than not owning it. By not owning it, we don't get to write the ending, and it's being written for us. And she uses Charlottesville as an example of that. She did go on to talk about power, and I want to speak to that for a second. She quotes Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in saying that power is the ability to affect change. Powerlessness is the most dangerous state we can ever experience, which kind of begins to explain the whole Black Lives Matter thing and the riots in the streets. She says power is perceived in our culture to be finite. Whites don't want to give up power because by giving it away, they become less powerful. She goes, this is power over someone, which is finite. So that's true if you believe in power over someone. And she says it's really about power with someone, a collective power, shared power, because that's infinite. She finishes by saying, if we own our story of white supremacy and recognize it as the basis for power over others, then we can change the narrative to one of shared power and create a different ending than the one we're headed for now. So I want to close with a story of a life and death impact for me of white supremacy, where it really hit home for me. And I'm going to bring back up the story of Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin in the black hoodie, which is why I'm wearing this today. So this comes from Wikipedia. On the night of February 26, 2012, in Sanford, Florida, George Zimmerman fatally shot Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old African-American high school student. Zimmerman, a 28-year-old mixed-race Hispanic man, was the neighborhood watch coordinator for his gated community, where Martin was visiting his relatives at the time of the shooting. Zimmerman shot Martin, who was unarmed, during an altercation between the two. Zimmerman was charged with Martin's murder but acquitted at trial on self-defense grounds. The incident was reviewed by the Department of Justice for potential civil rights violations, but no additional charges were filed, citing insufficient evidence. So at that time, when this shooting happened, and we didn't know the verdict at that point, my son and I were talking. I think it was actually a Sunday morning. And he's roughly the same age that Trayvon Martin would be and was at that time. So we talked about how white privilege had played a role in the outcome of this. Now he suggested, my son Alex, suggested that the way Trayvon was dressed and acted contributed to his shooting. He said, you know, Dad, there's these African-American guys at school and they're obnoxious on purpose. They dress funny and they stick their legs out in the hallway and makes us go around them and all that kind of stuff. So he was kind of you know, if you provoke something like this is bound to happen. I said, Alex, let's pretend for a second, we have relatives down in Florida. Let's pretend that our relatives live in Sanford, Florida, this gated community. And we went down there to visit them. And you were bored with these old relatives and you were hungry, so you went to the Quick Trip to go get some Skittles. And let's pretend for a moment that you had a black hoodie on and you had baggy jeans on that were sagging on your hips. You were dressed exactly the same way. And you went to get your Skittles, and this guy starts harassing you for whatever reason. Maybe you're young, maybe he doesn't like the way you look, maybe you crossed his lawn wrong or something. I know you've got a smart mouth. You're a referee at soccer games, and I've heard you tell parents, you've told parents off when they're shouting out too much at the game. So I know you've got it in you. So let's just assume you did that with this Zimmerman guy, George Zimmerman. I said, all the circumstances are exactly the same. Would you be dead? He thought about it for a minute, and he said, no. To me, this is one of the clearest examples of white supremacy. I can count on white supremacy to save my son because the color of his skin is white. And I can count on white supremacy to shoot Trayvon Martin because our collective story in this country believes that deep down my son's whiteness is superior to Trayvon Martin's blackness. White supremacists want us to own that story, to believe that story. Unitarian Universalists want to own the real story of white supremacy so we can write our own ending of inherent worth and dignity for everyone. Period. So as a takeaway, I'm going to leave you with this image. Until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons, is as important as the killing of white men, white mothers' sons. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it